started.
Okay, great. Well, welcome everyone. We are so glad you're here today. I'm Veronica White. I'm a member of the Global Impact Relations Network and personally very passionate about leveraging communications for change. On behalf of the Global Impact Relations Network, we want to thank you guys for participating in our Impact series, and our event today will be focused on best practices in launching a global impact report, a topic we're all very excited about. And just for background, for those of you who don't know, our global network consists of 500 communicators, 500 plus communicators from around the world who really promote the importance of purpose-led communications, principles, and practices. We use the tools of communications really to drive positive change and shine a light on the solutions to some of the world's most pressing issues. We have a really great panel of experts lined up for you today to discuss best practices for launching reports. I'm so excited to welcome Colleen Spelder, an ESG Strategy and Reporting Authority from McDonald's, and Gabby, Rocco, ESG Lead at Elevate Future Fund. And also my former colleague and friend, Mike Hauer, an expert in sustainability and impact comms, who's currently with Think Parallax. Just a bit of housekeeping. We're going to hold on questions until the end, so you can feel free to drop them into the chat. And we'll spend about 15 minutes at the end on questions. So thank you again, everyone, for joining. And Mike, over to you.
Thanks, Veronica. And hey, everybody. Thanks for being here today. We have a really interesting topic. Well, at least for some of us, might not be interesting for everybody. Impact reporting, which is lately in the last few years has really kind of reached its golden age. In 2020, I think the last data I saw, about 92% of the S&P 500 was reporting, and that number is only going to grow exponentially, I think, especially as regulatory uncertainties become more clear and so forth. And in my own role, Think Parallax, so we are a leading ESG strategy communications agency, and so one of the things that we do is reporting. So I'm having a lot of conversations with companies of all sizes that have never reported before, and so they reach out asking for help. Like, first of all, they're like, "What is ESG?" Like, let's start there. So I know today we've got a wide range of kind of levels of understanding of reporting. So for some of you who are more on the expert side, this might not be anything new to you. For others, this might be groundbreaking. We're trying to keep this kind of an accessible level. But if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. And also forgive us for any acronyms, because our space is plagued by way too many acronyms. I already threw one out at you, ESG, environmental, social, and governance. If you weren't aware, there's going to be several others, and Colleen and I have already promised to try to translate that to you as best as possible. So with no further ado, why don't we jump in and introduce our panelists here. So Colleen, do you want to go first?
Sure. Hi, everybody. My name is Colleen Spelder, and I am an ESG Strategy and Reporting Manager here at McDonald's. And I've been at McDonald's for just under a year, leading our purpose and impact reporting suite. So if you are checking things out now, that's perfectly fine. Or later, you can go to our website and see the breadth of our ESG reporting. And prior to this, I was at Flag, a ESG reporting and strategy agency. And before that, I was at Abbott. So I've had a bit of in-house and consultancy experience on the ESG reporting side of things.
Awesome. Gabby?
Yeah, thanks. Hi, everyone. My name is Gabby Rocco. I'm an ESG associate at Energy Impact Partners. Not quite a household name like McDonald's, so I'll give a really quick background on us. We're a venture capital firm focused on investing in companies that are leading the transition to clean energy, whether that's through electric mobility, companies working with utilities to modernize the grid. We're investing kind of all across that space. I've been at Energy Impact Partners for a little over 2 years, and I've helped build our ESG impact strategy really from the ground up. It's been a really exciting time, and really glad to talk with you all today.
Awesome. I'm excited that we have an investor, we have in-house corporate, and we have a consultant. So I think with all those perspectives, we should be able to unpack this and get a better understanding of reporting. So to kick this off, as everyone here probably knows, there's a million different names for impact reports. Impact report is one of them. Corporate responsibility report, ESG report, corporate sustainability report, whatever you want to call it. So all of these different types of reporting are focused on communicating impact. Some of them are a little bit different depending on how you create them. But I guess my first question to the panelists would be, if you're going about to create your first report, how do you decide what to even call it?
I can get started, Gabby. So, I think back to what we called, I think the 2017 report at Abbott, which I think was my very first report. And I believe we called it corporate responsibility back then. And just to kind of describe, how I have used, these terms and the types of content that we've included in these different reports. In my experience, corporate responsibility reports tended to include, a wider variety of content types. So maybe something that feels a bit more narrative or has more of a storytelling, feel to it to demonstrate performance against a certain environmental, social, economic, or governance topic. And then only within the last couple of years have I really seen companies owning and picking up that ESG label, which is exciting for me as somebody who personally really loves that approach and much more strategic way of thinking about reporting. But I do think is by no means like the only way to go about doing it. So ESG reports in my mind tend to very much be grounded in an understanding of the company's most material is the word you hear a lot, but you could also call it highest priority, of greatest relevance to the company's stakeholders, but a collection of topics, of issues are underpinning the report, and that selection of topics has been guided by a clear process of assessing, what topics are most important to stakeholders, have the greatest impact on the business. And so I feel like that's the greatest difference between something that's more impact corporate responsibility versus an ESG report. But curious, Gabby, what you think about that.
Yeah, I totally agree with your point that it depends on the priority and kind of the focus of the report. From our side, our first ever kind of reporting here was just called an impact report because it was really more of a technical paper describing the impacts of the companies that we invest in, how much carbon they've saved, electricity saved, things like that, and all of the details on how we went about doing that. As we've kind of broadened our ESG and impact work to include more things like looking at the diversity of our companies and looking at their policies and their other practices, we started to report on that as well. And we've changed the name of our report to an ESG and impact performance report instead. So, as we've kind of broadened the scope, changed the name to match that.
Awesome. And I would also just add from my own experience, I think the trend we're also starting to see for the transformation from maybe like a corporate responsibility report to an ESG report is sometimes hard for communications pros to stomach, because it's really moving away from like the feel good stories that are what most PR people are trained to look for, or the most interesting stories, to moving more towards the data driven stories, which might not be as gripping, but tells more of your broader narrative. So and that's something that I've been, some of the reports I've been working on the last few years, trying to get our clients away from, just stuffing a report with all the stuff that sounds good to like what's actually material to your business and what is actually moving the needle. And then you can separate those stories out, and maybe you put those feel good stories somewhere else, like on your website or another, other more fun stuff. Great. So next question is more focused on the challenges about creating an impact report. So, what I kind of just touched on a few about, there's too much to report on. What are some of the biggest challenges that you faced with reports, either creating them or consuming them, and how can organizations overcome them?
Yeah, I'm happy to take the first stab at this. So I think one of the biggest challenges is, there's really a proliferation of frameworks and standards. We mentioned before kind of an alphabet soup of acronyms. I won't go into any of them right now, but there are just a ton of different frameworks out there, and there really is no one size fits all. Organizations kind of need to pick and choose, what makes the most sense for them. And I think it's really challenging because no two reports are going to look the same. Every company is going to have different priorities, different frameworks that it makes sense to communicate their ESG and impact priorities through. And so it's difficult to, communicate your methodologies and the nuances of what you're doing, especially compared to peers. And in the, investing space, this is definitely a challenge for investors to compare companies and funds and, what they're doing when there's no sort of standard way to report and to assess all of that.
I think that, yeah, I agree with all that. And I think, maybe it's just me, but I feel like over the years, despite all the change going on in the ESG reporting and just ESG space in general, I have found that the most challenging conversations I'm having are about who we're actually trying to reach with a given report or, website update or specific deliverable piece that we're preparing. I think that oftentimes, there's a lot of excitement around, reporting some of this information, maybe, even some hesitations from different partners like legal, but I do find that just based on the people that I've been working with in this space, there's sometimes kind of that missing piece of who exactly we're trying to reach and what's the impact we're trying to drive. And, I think that for this audience in particular, this should resonate, but I try to often go back to, what are the key needs and expectations of this audience that we're trying to reach. And, trying to customize that, thinking and question depending on the piece we're preparing. So, McDonald's, we do our ESG reporting across our website, which is a little bit of a different approach. I think something you don't see quite as often. Oftentimes you'll see a standalone PDF or something like that. Each of our web pages across our purpose and impact website actually serve as like our living and breathing report. And something that I think we talk about a lot is for various topics, who is the primary stakeholder group that we know cares the most about that particular topic, what type of information are they looking for on that topic, and typically, that lines up with what we're ready to share in terms of progress and then, strategic updates. But it is a good, I think, check for those of us preparing these reports, like, do we really know who we're trying to reach? Are we trying to reach everybody? And if we're doing that, are we really reaching anybody? So that's kind of a helpful steer that I've found.
Yeah, I totally agree. We've had the same challenge. I think, as an investor, we're trying to reach other investors, we're trying to reach entrepreneurs, we're trying to reach the broader, clean energy space. And so it can be difficult to focus on so many things at once, and definitely resonate with your point on, going back to who is this for and why are we doing it, as one of the ways to kind of help overcome that at all the kind of different steps in the process.
Yeah, and I would add to that I think for many companies, reporting has just become something you do. It's just like muscle memory, and it's very important periodically to kind of reconsider, why are you doing this? Who are you trying to reach? It's very common for companies to conduct what's called a materiality assessment. So for those who are unfamiliar, it's just a fancy way of figuring out what your most important issues are to your stakeholders and also to your business. And so that's a process like GRI recommends it every 2 years. Sorry, another acronym, Global Reporting Initiative, one of the reporting frameworks. So just making sure that you know why you're doing it, because companies spend a lot of money on this, a lot of time and money, and sometimes doing it the way you've always been doing it is not necessarily the best way. McDonald's doing it online is actually a trend we've been seeing more companies following, which I'm hoping to see more of, because the PDF approach is nice, but it's very time consuming and not always the most effective. And so as we see more companies kind of moving more towards a kind of like a digital kind of real-time reporting framework, that's kind of the future, I think, that we're seeing a lot of companies move towards. So it's a constantly changing space is just kind of the takeaway there. Great. Well, Colleen, you kind of already touched on this. This question was aimed at you. So, what are McDonald's most important stakeholders? You've got tons of stakeholders. As a publicly traded company who probably interacts with almost every person in the world at some point. So, when you're thinking about your reporting, how do you prioritize? Like, who would you say is your number one or number two, number three stakeholder? And then how do you tailor your reporting towards those stakeholders?
Sure. So appreciate the I take it as a compliment that the scale is very much there, because I do think that's how it feels for us working in the global impact organization, and especially in the ESG strategy team. We are thinking all of the time about that wide variety of stakeholder groups, and the way I've started to refer to this is at McDonald's, more than any other company I've worked with or worked for, the in your inbox stakeholder feedback is very real. It's not something where I feel like we are guessing at what our stakeholders want or are interested in. There's actually quite a bit of specific guidance that they're providing to us, which is both a challenge and an opportunity. I think that in a lot of ways, having worked in other spaces where you are kind of guessing at based on what you're hearing and seeing, what your stakeholders care about. I don't feel that same challenge here. So, I think that the group in particular that has been most interesting for me over the last, like I said, several months that I've been here is the investor group. And I think that that's, something that people are seeing regardless of, where they are, how big or how small the company is, as long as, of course, it's public. I think that the investor audience has been getting up to speed on this topic in a very real way. And I think that oftentimes asking ourselves as ESG reporting professionals whether we have asked the questions to our investors of which frameworks, which ratings or rankings they're referring to, whether we can glean from their questions what they're referring to. We've started to be able to notice which ESG risk ratings, for example, our investors are actually referring to based on the way they're articulating certain questions, things that they're flagging that we know are appearing in or referred to in different risk ratings. So, I speak about that investor group because I think they're the most interesting one to now engage with as somebody who's, been in the space for a little while. I also think that the NGO, stakeholder group is certainly one that we have been working with for decades across a number of issues. Strategic partnerships is a key part of how we advance our strategy across different issues. And so we value those as true partnerships. And so I think we pay close attention to the feedback that we get from those stakeholders. And when, we maybe are not progressing or maybe not reporting on something that they think is important or that, the industry is, moving towards, we're usually, that's not a surprise to us. We usually have a seat at those tables. And so I would say those two groups in particular, inform and guide our reporting the most. And, we are looking into ways to get more of a sense and a pulse check on what other groups like, customers, like you mentioned, Mike, what they think about this. But I think, like we said before, it manifests differently. I don't think that they're going and reading our, several thousand word climate action page in the same way that some of those NGO stakeholders or investors actually may.
Yeah, and I guess if anybody's reading these reports, it's investors. So that's a great segue into Gabby. I'm glad that we have investors' perspective here. So from where the investors are sitting, how does reporting fit into this? Like, how are you consuming these reports? Are you reading them from cover to cover? Are you just plugging them into your algorithms? Can you talk a little bit more about how you use ESG reports as kind of a proxy for figuring out, which companies to invest in?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think we sit in an interesting space here, kind of in between. We're investing in smaller, startups who sometimes are not, really at the stage where they're providing that information up front. But we are kind of sitting in between the larger investors who, have access to these companies through our funds. And so in one sense, our investors have certainly been very interested in ESG, and we're engaged in helping to shape our strategy and process that we have today, to make sure that our reporting and our practices are aligned with, what they're looking for. And that really does flow through into our investment decisions. Obviously, our fund is focused on environmental solutions, so that is kind of the first, gating criteria of whether we'll even consider an investment. It should fall into that thesis. And it is, like I mentioned, for these smaller startups who are not publicly reporting on other types of ESG or impact criteria, we do need to, ask them for that type of information, and they may or may not even have it yet. But importantly, we work with them to improve some of that criteria over our investment period, help them figure out how to measure things. If they want to do an impact report, work with them on figuring all of that out, figuring out what types of frameworks they should be reporting under and things like that. And so we do, in that sense, we're evaluating their ESG criteria. It's just not as much through the reporting side as it is for larger companies.
Since I know we have a lot of people in here who probably are unfamiliar, can one of you just explain quickly like how the reporting frameworks work and the rating agencies, that whole ecosystem, just so people can get a better understanding of how that works?
Sure. Big task. So Gabby, feel free to jump in if I miss anything. No, I'm just joking, but I think that there is a vast world of ratings, rankings, and frameworks that are out there. Pick any environmental, social, economic, or governance issue, and there's probably a framework that exists that's trying to move the needle and increase disclosure and transparency around that particular topic. But I think that the ones that are getting the most attention are the ones that are trying to kind of give companies an opportunity to provide a well-rounded picture of what they're doing across a number of topics. And so the requirements that I like to call them just disclosure requirements across each of those different ratings, rankings, frameworks, those disclosure requirements will cut across a number of different issues. So some of the ones that you might have heard about are SASB, the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board. They are being enveloped in a new organization, but are still relevant. And from what we understand, those standards will remain. Mike mentioned GRI earlier. The TCFD, Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, is another big one that you might have heard about. So there are a number out there that that companies use as a reference, and that when I was talking about that investor feedback, I found it most beneficial to actually ask, or like I said, look for what your investors are actually referencing, because I think a lot of the frameworks or rankings, ratings present themselves and market themselves as catering to a certain stakeholder group's interests. And I think it's always good to double check that and verify that with actually your stakeholders, because I've found that sometimes the guiding wisdom is actually not applicable for a certain company's investors, for example.
Yeah, I agreed with that point. I think there are certain standards like SASB that can be applicable to pretty much everyone and anyone, but there are others that are definitely more targeted in the financial space. We're a signatory to the UN PRI, that's the United Nations Principles of Responsible Investment, and so that's kind of one of the leading organizations in our field, and there are many others. We could go into a long laundry list, but I think definitely your point about understanding what your stakeholders are looking for and which frameworks and rankings are important is the most important piece here.
And for anybody that's interested, you can get GRI certified. So there's like training courses you can take. There's different providers in different areas. They used to do that. Well, they used to do them in person. I don't know with COVID if that's happening anymore. But if you're interested in getting those certifications, the opportunities are out there for SASB and the different TCFD and all those other ones. So might not be necessary unless you're going to be working on a report. But if that's something that you're hoping to get into, that could be a useful thing to get done. Great. So moving it kind of back to the nuts and bolts of creating a report. So what are some of the elements of an effective ESG report and why? Pretty broad, but yeah, Colleen.
Yeah, sure. I can take it away. Yes. So I do think it goes back to audience, not to keep saying the same thing, but I think that largely speaking, that materiality assessment or something similar, I think, is a key starting point for understanding what topics you're going to cover. And plenty of companies take different approaches to deciding and prioritizing what topics they will cover in a report. I think that early stage, first time reporters, maybe it's not necessary to do a formal assessment, but I think over time it becomes increasingly necessary to justify why you're selecting reporting on certain topics over others. I think that there's very formal assessment approaches that are out there. I think that companies sometimes disclose the results of those assessments, or other times they simply state that they've undertaken an assessment, and then they go ahead and report on the topics that came out of that assessment as being most important. But I feel like that is key, because I think that oftentimes, whether you're talking to internal stakeholders who are reviewing, approving the content that you want to include in a report, or ultimately externally answering for what you've put out there, I think you do need to have an answer to why these topics were selected. And I think that those frameworks, to be honest, can help to serve as a guiding, a guidepost in getting there too. The SASB standards that we were talking about a minute ago, the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board standards, are industry specific. And so they're a great, focused starting point for looking at the topics that investors have, fed back through that organization to indicate as the most important topics for that particular industry. But I think that getting that clear, and then not forgetting to have some of the more communications like pieces, such as, just a really clear introduction, mapping out, what is your strategy? What's it grounded on? What kind of stakeholder engagement does your company engage in? Is there anything that you can say about contributions to broader industry, table stakes issues like the SDGs that might not be appropriate for first-time reporters? And then as you get into each of the topics, what are the key data points, key performance indicators that the company uses? What are the key policies that help to guide progress? And then, where appropriate, is there any sort of external stakeholder group that can help to validate the work that you're doing, that you've partnered with, or any leaders that can have, a leadership voice to show that, this is an issue that's being taken seriously by the senior most leaders in the company?
Yeah, I think you laid that out really well, Colleen. I think, for a report to, be effective, it does need to have a clear purpose that's laid out in an easily digestible way, which can be challenging when you have so much information that you want to get out there. The number one thing that we've tried to prioritize above any, specific element or content is transparency. So if we're, publishing a number or a calculation, we want to make sure we explain how we got there, and especially in those areas where there can be a lot of nuance, we try and provide as much detail as we can, so that our audience can really understand what we're doing when we're in such a technical space. But we also want to kind of balance that again with the communications aspect of presenting things clearly and concisely, and some of those more marketing focused elements. It's definitely a challenge to kind of incorporate both together into one report.
Great. And I would also add that something that I've been seeing more recently too is this commitment to kind of authenticity and transparency, which is basically saying, being willing to report on things that you're not necessarily doing well at, like that, which is very counterintuitive to many kind of corporate identities, and especially in the PR world, where it's very focused on, minimizing the negatives and maximizing the positives. And we're kind of entering this new era where, telling the whole story of like, hey, you know what, we set a goal and we had some setbacks and we didn't hit it, but we're doing X, Y, and Z to get there. That's going to engage particularly your investors more better than hiding all the blemishes and only showing the good things. And I think also when you talk about different stakeholders like customers and things like that, like everybody's seeing greenwashing plenty. So, it's easy to sniff out. So you're better off talking about your flaws than hiding them. So the reports that I've seen out there that are the best are the ones where they're actually willing to talk about the areas where they need to improve. And part of that goes back to, a more robust ESG strategy, which is beyond the scope of this conversation. But it's really just taking a kind of a long-term view of, ESG sustainability. It's not a destination, it's a journey. And then, these reports are kind of telling the story of that journey. Great. So, once the report's published, you put it, you spent months putting it together, and now you hit publish. It's easy to just kind of walk away or start working on next year's report, but that's obviously not the best practice. So this question is kind of aimed at both, maybe Colleen, more relevant for you, but maybe Gabby as well. What do you do with the report to get the most out of it? And this might be the most maybe useful for the audience here. So, if you're a communications professional and maybe your role isn't specifically sustainability, but your company's putting out a sustainability report, how can you leverage that as a communications tool to, advance your marketing and sustainability goals?
Yep. So I think that, again, not to be a broken record, but I think it goes back to what content, actually made its way into that report. So, if it was more of a storytelling, type report, I think that's important to get very clear on, or more data driven. I think that helps to set expectations around, opportunities to amplify in a launch, and what audiences might be most resonate with the information that was gathered through the report. But I think that, if you are the one leading, the development of the report, or you're working with somebody within your company, I think what's most helpful is for the, ESG or impact reporting lead to be very clear about what the 3, to 5, let's say, key highlights were across topics for the year. I think that oftentimes that can be kind of a hard question for an ESG reporting person to answer, because there is so much that is going into the development of a report like this, and we can oftentimes be in the weeds, especially, I don't know if others feel this, but at this time of year, I feel like March and April, my head is always really deep into all of the details. And it's also the right time, if you're looking at a summer launch, to, start thinking about that and zooming out. And so, how you weigh what those key headlines might be depends on your audiences. And also, I think, where you're trying to move the needle in terms of, influencing stakeholder, understanding and perceptions about the company. So if there are particular issues that you've been delivering or leading, notable progress on, or strong performance on for years, or areas where you're trying to kind of carve out that space in an industry, obviously those are great places to look at what your progress was for the prior year. But often your progress might differ year to year on a certain topic. You might not have had as much of a big news story year as another. And I think that being comfortable with shifting, what those headlines are year to year, not feeling like stuck in a certain, in reiterating a certain topic every single year is important, because at least in my opinion, showing that variety year over year shows strong performance across issues. And so, if you maybe had planet topics as your lead for a prior year, like, is there an opportunity to draw out more of the, social people related progress points, this year? And always just remember, it's about having the right balance, and that looks different for every company.
Yeah, and as a kind of smaller firm, the feedback that we've gotten in terms of, trying to make a splash with our report, and how to improve on that we're trying to incorporate is, again, having a really clear purpose that's laid out in an easily digestible way, that's maybe 1 to 2 pages, that can be shown to someone who doesn't live and breathe impact and ESG reporting day in, day out, and they'll be able to understand what the purpose is, and why it's important. And that's really been important and key for us for kind of getting the report out there.
And I would add, as a former journalist that was writing about sustainability, I would get flooded with pitches about impact reports, ESG reports, and just hate to break it to you all, it's not news. Like, reporters not going to write about it unless it's, maybe they will if they're like a beat reporter and they talk about your company, but generally speaking, it's not news. But what you can think of it as like, it's kind of like your single source of truth. And then throughout the year, you're going to be telling stories. So maybe you put out your report once a year. You can put out some content around it. I said content, probably your better bet, putting out videos or blog posts, things like that, social media. And then, maybe let your reporters that know that it's coming out, but really focusing more on like the broader narrative and putting out, updates throughout the year of progress on your report. So you maybe even not even waiting until each report comes out to update is also great. I know McDonald's probably does that with their website. It's probably easy to do that, right? So, maybe you don't have a huge website yet, but even just like, updating periodically through blog posts or things like that, or maybe press releases about, we're making progress on these goals, or we're making this commitment, just showing that you're actually doing stuff. And it's not just like once a year you're putting a report out. Just some insights that I've seen. Great. So this next question, it's kind of more focused on kind of careers. So, there's lots of people that are trying to break into this space, or maybe they're in communications PR, but they want to maybe move more towards a, sustainability communications type role, and maybe reporting is part of that. What advice would you give to someone like this trying to either pivot or kind of move into more sustainability comms, particularly with a focus on reporting?
Yeah, I think I can go first. I think that, this type of role really requires a multidisciplinary skill set, an understanding of all the different parts of an organization that's reporting, and how to bring all of the different elements of ESG from each of those into one cohesive report. Whether it's coming from an investor relations perspective or PR and marketing, you can kind of bring all of that together. I think the ability to kind of collaborate between a lot of different stakeholders is one of the more difficult parts of a big effort of getting a report out like this. And having experience doing that, for myself at least, has definitely served me well. And I think that for having done that for other types of projects and deliverables has been really helpful in understanding what needs to go into the huge effort of getting these types of reports out.
Yep, I think that's a great point. I think that the point about demonstrating an ability to coordinate and manage, a project with, 50, 60, 70 different subject matter experts is, I think, a really key. Obviously, that's a tricky thing to, I think, to do in other, areas. I'm not sure how many other, areas you have that many different subject matter experts that are weighing in, but I think showing an ability to work across, functions, teams, areas of the business is key. And I think that that's something that, that is something that folks can build that skill set in a lot of different areas. But I would say that like a differentiator as we move into the next couple of years, in my mind, for somebody really trying to step into the ESG reporting space, is being knowledgeable and understanding what's going on in the space in terms of those frameworks, ratings, rankings, and then the regulatory updates that are coming. I know that doesn't sound nearly as fun or sexy, but I think that there's a real hunger within organizations to have somebody at the table who is watching and understanding what's going on, or at least knows where to go to, stay up to date on that. What are the right sources and forums to get those updates? I don't think every company necessarily has somebody who is there. And so I feel like being able to watch the space, to learn about what's out there, and then as you move into looking into different jobs, being able to demonstrate that in interview type conversations would be compelling, because I think that is going to be the differentiator as we move forward on the ESG side of things. I think it's becoming increasingly legally relevant and legally managed. So, Mike, a point you made earlier, I am, wondering if the pendulum will swing in the next couple of years based on some of the regulatory changes that are coming out, and whether companies will just be a little bit more aware of the legal implications of disclosing some of this information that, they might have been more comfortable disclosing previously. So I think that seeing it as this maybe slightly more not regulated, but carefully managed space, I think is a part of the job, while still being able to, flex over to that creative storytelling, side of it. So kind of a complicated answer there, but hope that some of that was valuable.
Oh,
Did we lose Mike, or is he just frozen on my side?
He's frozen on my side too.
Can I be so bold as to answer a question in the chat that I saw?
Do it, Colleen.
Great. And Gabby, jump in too, but Anne, I liked your question about whether we look at competitors to see what they're reporting on and whether we add those topic areas to our reporting to allow for benchmarking, annual measurement, future annual reports. I think it's a great question. And I think that benchmarking is something done all over the place in this space, whether it's looking at goals, targets, disclosures, policies. I think it's how the space has moved forward up to this point is by kind of watching what everybody else is doing and what they're moving forward on with their, partnerships and in their particular industry. So I absolutely think that's a key part of the job. And I'll say that, when we kick off reporting, we feel as the ESG reporting folks that it's actually kind of a responsibility to bring some of those benchmarking insights to our subject matter experts at the beginning of the process to make sure that they're aware of, disclosures that other companies that they value, that they see as, leaders in the space are putting forward certain disclosures. And I think it helps to make the case sometimes to different groups, whether that be leaders or legal, about where we want to be and need to be moving forward in terms of disclosure. So I think benchmarking is actually a really key part of this job.
Yeah, completely agreed. We've done, similar exercises where we've looked at our, closest peers and what they're reporting, and try to incorporate, anything that we think, maybe we should be reporting on a certain metric for our portfolio companies that we haven't thought about. Or, it's also helped us identify places where we think we're a leader in the market, where no one else seems to be reporting on a certain type of metric. And so it's been a really interesting process. And I think it's one that's important to repeat because, these reports keep coming out and people keep improving. So it's kind of an ongoing conversation here on our side.
Sorry, my internet died. I think the question was about benchmarking.
Yeah, Colleen went ahead and answered one of the audience questions.
Yeah, and I would add to what you guys just said is we're in the Wild West of reporting right now. So everybody's kind of just looking at everybody and seeing what they're doing. And then it's kind of chaos. So benchmarking is super important. Like that's the first thing most companies do when, especially if they're putting out their first report, is figuring out, where do we sit in our ecosystem with our competitors and maybe more beyond that, which that may change down the road as Colleen was saying, with the regulatory environment changing, that may change. But the thing is that the companies that are leading on it now will be in a better position down the road when that does happen. Great. This next question is actually a very, very relevant one. So, not all companies are public, obviously. So if you're working with or representing companies that are private, you're not necessarily expected to report on your sustainability ESG performance. So the question could be around that. So, if you're a private company, should you still report? And if so, is it going to be a little different than a publicly traded company? Does either of you want to answer that one?
Yeah, totally. I think most companies should report. From my perspective, we are a private company, and we've just seen that, regardless of public or private, this is really being driven by investors across the board. And as more and more of them get, up to speed on these types of issues, it's just going to be more and more important, almost like, you do your financial reporting, you also do your sustainability reporting. I think smaller companies, like I mentioned, some of the startups that we work with, aren't as focused on reporting just because they're focused on, building their businesses. But, we try and work with them to integrate some best practices so that when they get to the size where, it does start to make sense to report, that they're ready, and able to do that, because, they will have to, at some point. And I think the earlier that you can kind of get started with those types of things, the easier it becomes when it is time to do it.
Mm-hmm. And then something I would add to that, I think we're starting to see more pre-IPO companies realizing that it's important to get this in order before they go public. I used to be based in San Francisco, and I would have tons of conversations with startups that this was a couple years ago, and I think things have even changed since then, but they would say, oh, sustainability is important, it's cute, but like it's not key to our valuation right now. And as more and more companies go public, and the ones that actually have prioritized purpose and sustainability are coming out with better valuations, that's changing. And so I think what we're going to start seeing is impact reporting becoming more important for private companies or companies that are going public eventually. And also, I have a few clients that are large corporations that are private, and they have no plans on ever going public, and they still do it. And a lot of it's for bragging rights, because they want to compete with competitors that are public, but also their stakeholders care. Whether it's these investors are important, but there's other stakeholders that matter, particularly employees. Like attracting employees these days is not easy, and showing that you've got a steady ESG strategy is one of the best ways you can attract, particularly millennials and Gen Zers. So some thoughts on that. Next question is
hey, Mike.
Oh yeah. Oh hey Patrick, how you doing?
How's it going? Yeah. Hi everyone. I'm Patrick McCartney here from Genibus. I'd just like to chime in very quickly. There, great conversation. I came in a little bit late, unfortunately. I work in the emerging cannabis industry, and when we think about cannabis, we think about recreational, but it's very much bigger than that. It's medical health and wellness, and also industrial hemp. And what we're seeing is around the ESG is the end of the cannabis industry is still only a few years old, but ESG is really starting to take hold now of the publicly listed cannabis companies. More and more are starting to think about their strategy and how to build it in and so forth. But what the interesting thing is that when they talk about their ESG reporting, they're talking more about corporate social responsibility and sustainability. So there's a lot of confusion right now in the industry as to what ESG is with regards to materiality of the business versus sort of the external end of corporate social responsibility. And we've seen some of the publicly listed cannabis industry ESG reports, of which there are only 5 globally right now. All have come in this year in 2022. And we're starting to see the shift, though, as these companies start to think more about, okay, what are we talking about here? So, I worked at Sustainable Brands there for 10 years with Mike, and we were at the sort of the cusp of Unilever driving the ship around sustainable reporting and so forth. And we're sort of seeing the same now as the emerging cannabis industry starts to take hold. So very interesting comparisons, and I think we're off to a good start in the cannabis industry.
Thanks, Patrick. All right, so we've got time for a few more questions. We're going to try to get through these. If you have any additional questions, feel free to put them in the chat. The next one, this could be a topic of an entire panel. I actually have a white paper I helped pen last year that I could send out after that will answer this question, but more questions around what exactly is a materiality assessment and how do you create one? So I don't know, Colleen, maybe do you want to just very quickly, you don't need to go through the whole process, but maybe just high level, what exactly is it? And then what are this, what goes into making one, and what's the value, like what's the deliverable?
Sure. And I'll be careful here because I think this is evolving. I think this question and the answer to this question is very actively being debated across different spaces right now. So I think that historically, a materiality assessment was an undertaking to identify, prioritize, and then validate a list of the environmental, social, economic, and governance topics that were, I'm going to pause here, that I should say fit a certain set of criteria. Before that used to be, what are those topics that have the greatest impact on your business and are most influencing your stakeholders' decision making. But that's evolved quite a bit over the last couple of years, and what that criteria is, it continues to evolve, especially as there's increasing regulation around how you're using that term and whether the topics that you identify as material should actually be reported on in your financial reports. And so it's a tricky thing. So I guess my answer that I'm just going to stick to for this one is that you should always go about, my opinion, producing a materiality assessment report and conducting a materiality assessment with a experienced partner personally, I think that, you read, companies who have undertaken a, report, having partnered with a number of different external agencies. And I think that having that third party at the table to help guide the process is really key, because at the end of the day, you're trying to come up with, a final list, a final picture that balances the varying perspectives, both internal and external. And I think that having, a very, real and honest look at what your collection of external stakeholders consider to be the most important topics is key, but that can be challenging to get, get internal folks all aligned on, especially if it differs from their, understanding of and beliefs around what topics are most material. So I'll just say there's plenty of great partners out there, and I encourage you to work with them if that's something you want to pursue with your company.
Not to promote Think Parallax, but give us a call. We do that. But I would say, just for those that are still kind of unclear about what materiality assessment is, you can think of it just pretty straightforward as you come up with a list of all the issues that could potentially impact your business or business impacts in regards to ESG. You narrow that list down. Then you either put out a series of surveys and then supplement that with some interviews, and then you collect the data, and then you plot. You've probably seen this, or maybe you haven't. Materiality matrix is kind of the final deliverable, which is just basically plotting your issues and their relative importance. And it's really not as complicated as it sounds. Like, really, most of it is just project management and getting all of your, your cats moving in the right direction. But yeah, it is helpful to have an external partner, but also you can do it in-house as well. There is no like standardization around this. So really, you could just send out a couple surveys and do some interviews and call a materiality assessment. It might not be very robust, but there really isn't like a necessarily a gold standard yet. But generally, partnering with professionals who know how to do it is the better outcome. This next question, I mean, I could probably just answer it. The answer is, can a report be too long? And I would say yes, they usually are. I don't know, Colleen or anybody else wants to chime in on that.
Sure. Yes, my goodness. I think that was a goal, to reduce, the report at a company I was with previously. Like, that was the goal, when I first came on, and we were able to do that. But I think that, at McDonald's, you'd look across a lot of our different pages, and we have extensive reporting, on each of these topics on each page. These are very, very long, lengthy pages. And, it's not because we're not good at, prioritizing or cutting things down. It's because we do have actually a lot of stakeholders who are expecting each and every word that is on, that page. And so I think that they can absolutely be too long, but I also feel that, length should not be, the be all end all if you're really clear on the stakeholders that you're working to impact and what information they need to make, their decisions about working with your company.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think that companies can definitely, fall into the trap of trying to include everything under the sun and be everything to everyone, as opposed to, like we've been talking about, conducting materiality assessments and including the things that are relevant to their stakeholders, and just can sometimes, especially in early stages, just kind of put everything out there. But we encourage our companies and ourselves to think critically about those things before putting information out.
Yeah, and I would add, generally, reports that are too long are the ones that try to appease every audience. And by trying to make everybody happy, you're going to make nobody happy. And so that's why, kind of going back to what we were talking about earlier, really getting clear on who your stakeholders are that you're really trying, like, what's the purpose of doing this besides the fact that just like everybody's doing it, and then getting clear on who you're trying to reach, and then thinking more strategically, like, how does this report fit into a broader communication strategy around ESG? So, maybe there's content that you could put on a blog post or on a website or in social media, and then maybe you link to it in your report, so you don't have to have a whole section on that. So maybe there's a case study that could live on your website, you link to it versus having it take up a whole page in your report. Also, the way you actually, this is something that I actually learned at Think Parallax, because part of what we do is also designing the reports, and how you present the information visually is also very important. I'm more of a writer type, but I've learned kind of like how you present the data is as important as any kind of copy you create. So really thinking about how are you taking up space in the PDF or in the report, and how are you visualizing, any kind of numerical data or things like that. So, but I would say, just to be kind of blunt about it, if it's over 100 pages, it's too long, no matter who you are. Although I do have some clients, like especially if you're in certain industries like pharma, like you have so many disclosures, like I can't remember how many pages their disclosures were, but lots of your report might just be data tables that people are going to maybe skim through. And that's fine. Then maybe you just have an appendix that's pretty long, but or you can also break your report up into a summary report. So then you have like just kind of the upfront summary report that people can actually read, more as a story, and then the rest of it's more skimmable. And so most people are going to be skimming these. Like very few people are going to be reading this, at night next to the fireplace. So yes, great. So, okay, next question, fun one. Which companies are leading on reporting? And you can't say your own company, that's the rule.
So I also feel like it would be disingenuous to list too many companies, because prior to McDonald's, I was at an agency. And so I think I would find myself picking the ones that we worked with. So I think I might defer to kind of a way that I've tried to back into this answer, at least when I was a consultant and trying to understand who was actually doing the best work. I think that Dow Jones, which I think is now going by a different name, but their CSA, Dow Jones Sustainability Index, and I think it's the Corporate Sustainability Assessment now. They have a nifty tool on their website where you can actually go and search, who the industry leaders were for, various different industries. And I found that to be useful to back my way into what companies are reporting a lot of great information, because Dow Jones does often require that the information that you're reporting to them is also public. And so companies that score well tend to be doing a great job of reporting that information publicly. So kind of an interesting way of backing your way into who is maybe leading in a particular industry, and maybe helpful if, some of the companies that I might list off, big brand names, don't really apply for your company. So encourage you to check out that website to see some great companies.
Yeah, I think that's a great resource. I think from our perspective, again, leading in this reporting kind of depends on your industry, on your stakeholders, on what's important. So it can be hard to determine just, two reports side by side, which one is better by any sense of the word. But I would say that I think in terms of just best practices, I always go back to transparency. If you're looking at a report and trying to determine if it's greenwashing or not, you can usually figure that out just by trying to understand where numbers and figures are coming from, and whether how much information is really in there and how much is just kind of words and fluff. I think is one way we've taken to look at it.
And I would just add that at the end of the day, any report is better than no report. So if your organization doesn't have a report, just putting one out, even if it's not the fanciest report, it's better than nothing. It's starting somewhere. And again, it kind of goes to this, ESG is all about having a growth mindset and thinking about how can you improve constantly versus being the best, which is really hard to do sometimes. And especially in the corporate world where we're very competitive. And healthy competition is good, but just remember that we're all on the same team at the end of the day, which is addressing environmental, social issues. So I think that's all the time we have. Veronica, why don't we throw it back to you to say some housekeeping stuff?
I'll go ahead and jump in with that, Mike. Thank you so much to our panel and to our moderator. I'm Melissa Orozco. I'm the Executive Director of the Impact Relations Institute, and just really pleased with the conversation and the content today. Thank you, all of you. Quick housekeeping: if there's other topics that you're keen to learn about, other brands that you're keen to learn from, please drop it into the chat. We exist to educate communicators and marketers on how to use the tools of communications for positive change. Also, if you are interested in joining our organization from a board perspective, or if you know anybody that's interested, we do have a couple seats available on the programming committee. So please shoot us a note. You can shoot me a note personally at melissa@ulupr.com or hello@impactrelations.org. Jenna, if you could just put those emails into the link, that would be great. And the last thing is, if you want to stay apprised on any future Impact Relations Institute councils, please pledge. And the link is here. I'll drop it in again, but please go ahead and pledge, and you'll stay apprised in the newsletter, and you'll get invites to all of our future programming. So that's 11 o'clock on the dot. Got to keep that time integrity. Thank you everyone for joining us, and thank you for all the great questions.